Dear students, in my last lecture on Dickens's Great Expectations, I talked about mm, the critical summary and the title. Now, in this lecture, I will focus on characterization and the ending. Uh, Talking about characterization, I will particularly focus on the character of Pip in this lecture, and I will focus on the other characters in my subsequent lectures. And after I finish uh, on focusing on Pip, then I will try to talk about I'll talk about the ending. Now let us first talk about the character of Pip. Peep, as we know, is the protagonist of Dickens's Great Expectations. Now, the method that I will follow in analyzing the character of Peep is this. I will first focus on the important events, important incidents that happen to Peep as Peep grows up, and then I will try to analyze those events, those incidents, uh, uh, and I will try to draw the character of Peep, analyzing those events and incidents. Now let us first look at the important events that happen to Peep. When the novel opens, I mean in chapter 1, Peep is uh, portrayed as an orphan of probably 8 years old, and he is raised by Mr. Joe and his wife Gargery. One day, uh, suddenly, he meets a stranger, and the name of the stranger, is Magwitch in the graveyard. He meets Magwitch in the graveyard, and this meeting has a profound impact on the life of Peep later on. Next, as Peep grows up, he is appointed as an apprentice in Joe's small factory, in Joe's smithy. Next, Peep gets to meet Miss Havisham, and in the same house, that is the Sati's house, Peep also meets Estella. Then Peep gets to meet Mr. Jaggers. Mr. Jagger, is a famous lawyer from London. And as he meets Mr. Jaggers, Peep's aspirations come to surface. Because Mr. Jaggers, as you know, that this meeting with Mr. Jagger happens or takes place in chapter number 18. As you know, Mr. Jaggers describes Peeps having great expectations. That's the first time that the phrase great expectations is used. Then Peep goes to London as desired by Mr. Jaggers and starts to stay at the house of the Pocket family there, and also starts there to develop a friendship with Herbert. Now, who is this Herbert? Herbert, we will later know, is a distant relative of Miss Havisham. Now, while staying in London, Peep uh, gets one invitation from his home, from his village, from Mr. Joe, that Mr. Joe would visit London. This takes place in chapter number 27. This chapter number 27 and 28 are very important because uh, now Peep gets an invitation from from Joe, his brother-in-law, that Joe would be visiting him in London. Now, hearing this, Peep gets highly concerned, and uh, he's not happy with the news. And next, in chapter number 28, we also see that Peep is visiting his hometown, and when Peep visits his hometown, he visits in a coach, and in that same coach also we get to see two convicts. Now Peep, as he travels with those two convicts, Peep sort of recognizes those two convicts, and Peep tries to uh, get aside from the look of those two convicts. Now, from these two chapters, that is chapter number 27 and chapter number 28, Peep's snobbery is very much apparent, because when Joe informs Peep that he would be visiting London, he'd be visiting Peep in London, Peep thinks that Joe's uncouth and rustic behavior would be highly unbefitting in London. So Peep tries to brush aside this meeting, and when Peep visits his hometown, Peep also very surprisingly doesn't stay with the Joe family, with his brother-in-law and sister, that is Mrs. Gargery. Rather, Peeps hires a room in a local inn called Blue Boar and stays there. So Peep's snobbery, Peep's affectations, that he has accumulated gentility, he has accumulated culture, he has accumulated sophistication, is very much apparent here, and he starts hating the rural culture, he starts hating the rustic uncouth culture, as reflected in his behavior with his brother-in-law and Mrs. Gargery. Next, we get to see that when Peep, the more the narrative progresses, the more Peep gets drawn to Estella. Although Estella behaves very badly with Peep, Peep thinks that he is in love with Estella, and Peep tries to, as the narrative progresses, tries to develop a kind of attitude that he thinks will be attractive to Estella. Peep turns 21, Peep grows up, and he turns to the age of 21. That happens in chapter number 36, and in this chapter, that is chapter number 36, he gets the assurance of 500 pounds. Now, with this 500 pounds, Peep plans to help Harvard. Harvard, as we have talked about, is his very close friend that he has met coming to London. Now, after that, in chapter number 39, Peep gets to know his real benefactor. Peep, as of now, has known that Peep's benefactor is Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham is financing Peep's progress in London. But in chapter number 39, this mystery is revealed, and Peep gets to know his real benefactor. And the name of this real benefactor is none other than that convict who Peep had met in that graveyard, that is Abel Magwitch. But Peep maintains the secrecy about the identity of Abel Magwitch, because Magwitch is a convict, and police are looking for him. That's why it's very necessary to maintain a secrecy about Magwitch. Now, after that, we see that Peep saves. Now, narrative progresses sort of rapidly. After that, Peep saves Miss Havisham and from a fire, and in that process, Peep gets himself injured. After that, Peep, with his 500 pounds that Peep drew in his 21st birthday, Peep makes enough arrangement for the employment of Harvard, because Harvard falls in financial constraints, and Peep plans to help Harvard. After that, towards the end of the narrative, we see that Peep helps Magwitch escape London, but in the process, Magwitch is caught. Magwitch also gets imprisonment, and later on, Magwitch dies in jail. So 3 or 4 things happens very, very rapidly. Peep helps Magwitch escape London, but in the process, Magwitch himself gets caught, and Magwitch in that process of escape also gets entangled with a kind of uh, Magwitch gets entangled with a kind of tussle with the other convict, that is competition, and we will later and competition is none other than the person who hoodwinked Miss Havison into marrying. That's why Miss Havison behaves like the way she does, and then we see in the narrative that Magwitch is imprisoned, and later on Magwitch dies in jail. After that, towards the fag end of the narrative, Pip visits his native village or hometown, and he calls to Estella, and we see that Pip gets united with Estella. So these are the things that happen to Pip as the novel shows. Now, Pip, we have to remember, whatever we get to know through the mouth of Pip, because Pip in the narrative serves as the narrator. So whatever perspectives we will draw about the character of Pip, about the character of the protagonist, we will draw from the narrative of the first person narrator, who is none other than Pip himself. So let us try and draw some characteristics, features of Pip from those events, those incidents that happened to Pip. Now, Pip, it can be argued, is a round character. Now, the concepts of flat character and round character are concepts that have been developed by E.M. Forster in his famous Aspects of the Novel. This is a very famous book, Aspects of the Novel. It's a critical book which was published in 1927, and in that book, E.M. Forster talks about two types of characters, flat character and round character. Now, a flat character is a character who does not develop as the narrative progresses, but a round character is a character who develops, who changes as the narrative progresses. Now, Pip, we will also see, can be an example of a round character, because we will see that Pip, the character of Pip develops from childhood, or as he grows up from childhood to maturity. Not just he develops in terms of age, but he develops in terms of his behavioral pattern, in terms of his characteristic feature. And I will also argue that Pip is also a hero of a novel which is a Bildungsroman. Now, as you know, Bildungsroman, and with that we also know about Kunstlerroman. Bildungsroman is a novel in which, it's a German term, in which the protagonist grows up from childhood to maturity. And in Kunstlerroman, we know that the same thing happens, but the protagonist grows up to be an artist. But here we will focus on Bildungsroman only. Now, one of the chief features, I mean, if not the chief feature of Pip's character, is how he rises to the status of gentility. Now, the overriding theme of all the incidents, all the events that happen to Pip is the theme of gentility. Now, throughout his life, Pip only tries to become a gentleman. And he tries to become a gentleman because primarily he wants to impress Estella, because he thinks that Estella is in love with him, and at the same time he tries to become a gentleman at the cost of brushing aside or leaving behind what is very much associated with his life. That is, he starts to live from his childhood brother-in-law with his brother-in-law and sister, Mr. Joe and Mrs. Gargary. But once Pip is in London and sort of embraced the aura of gentility, he hates those rustic creatures, those uncouth manners that Mrs. Joe and Mr. Joe Affold, that we have seen that happening in chapter number 27 and 28 that I have already talked about. Now, no doubt the sense of gentility gets infused into Pip through his contact with Miss Havisham when he visits the house, and surely with Estella at the Sati's house. The more Estella disparages, belittles Pip, putting him into public shame, the more Pip feels the pull of rising above the border of insult and humiliation. Now, Pip is continuously getting insulted, humiliated by Estella, by the behavior of Estella, but Pip thinks that he has to cross over, he has to rise above those humiliation. If he only can do it, he will be able to reach the status of gentility. The illusion of love thus gets Pip drawn more to the aspiration of becoming a gentleman. Although Pip was riding the social ladder to rise up, he perhaps was backlagged by some factors. Now, as I talked about, he tries to get to the status of a gentleman by or at the cost of some factors. Now, what are those factors? Number one, his sense of guilt. His sense of guilt, which arises out of his association with Magwitch, because he at the back of his mind has a kind of fear that he might be recognized by those convicts which are very, very much present during the during where he used to live, or where he used to live. Number one. Number two, when he visits the Newgate prison. Newgate prison is a famous prison in contemporary England. He visits the Newgate prison while waiting for Estella's coach, and that happens in chapter number 32. He thinks, when he visits the Newgate prison, he thinks, and I quote, "How strange it is that he should be," I quote, "encompassed by all this taint of prison and crime." Now, when he visits the Newgate prison, he has spent considerable amount of time in London. Now, living in London, he has forgotten his past life, and when he comes to encounter the prison and the prison mates, he feels very strange. That's why he says, quote unquote, "How strange." And Pip also feels encompassed by all these taint of prison and crime. So Pip feels that it's not a very good sight at all. Pip also says it should have reappeared on 2 occasions, starting out like a stain that was faded out but not gone. It should in this new way pervade his fortune and advancement. Again, Pip also feels a kind of backlagged when Magwitch returns in chapter number 39. Pip falls in a kind of uneasiness because by the time chapter number 39 is being written, Pip has spent, as I told you, considerable amount of time in London. So Pip feels that the arrival of Magwitch would sort of mar his image of becoming a gentleman. But as the narrative progresses towards the end, Pip feels guilt-ridden inwardly because he may have psychologically felt discomforted, and he starts to help Magwitch. He helps also Magwitch to escape, although that happens in vain. Pip's decision to help Herbert through Clarriker is a Londoner who later on employs at the advice of Pip Herbert, and Herbert in the process gets a job. The determination. Now we can conclude Pip's character by saying that there are some parallels in Pip's character. For example, Pip was being helped by an unknown person till some time of his life. Similarly, Pip also helps Herbert to come out of his financial hell. And as Pip is very much determined to become a gentleman, Pip is also very much determined to help the other characters, that is Herbert and other people. Uh, and this is how we can sum up by saying that Peep is a character who develops, uh, not in terms of his age, from maturity to, I mean, from childhood to maturity, but in terms of also his behavioral pattern, because Peep is at times very snob. Peep is very snobbish. Peep is at times very much hateful about the uncouth and rustic behavior, but Peep is at the same time very much helpful. Peep is at the same time uh, a person who extends his helping hand even when he knows that the person he is helping is not the person who had helped Peep. For example, when he saves the life of Miss Havisham from the fire, Peep himself gets injured, but despite that, Peep helps Miss Havisham. And also, last but not the least, Peep gets united with Estella, knowing fully well that Estella throughout the Peep's life has hated Peep, but Peep ultimately gets united with Estella, and Peep's, it is hinted at that Peep as if lives happily ever after. So Peep as a character can be a round character, and and Peep is also a character of a novel which is which is an example, which can be an example of Bildungsroman. So this is how I want to describe Peep and analyze the character of Peep. If you have any sort of observation, any doubt, any question, you can ask me over telephone. You can ask me via email.